Lou Rockwell. I'm president of the Institute, and on behalf of Mrs. Mises and the rest of our board, I want to welcome you all to our second Stanford program. Well, it's very appropriate that we start off with, we've got a lot of stars here this week, but I don't think there's any question within Austrian economics, as well as certain other circles, Murray Rothbard is the star. Murray got his bachelor's and his master's and his PhD at Columbia University, where he studied under Joseph Dorfman, and did his dissertation on the Panic of 1819, later published under that title. He was professor for many years at New York Polytechnic. Now is the S.J. Hall Distinguished Professor of Economics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Murray is the author of 16 books, hundreds of articles, extremely prolific scholar, and right now is working on the first history of thought from an Austrian perspective. And I know I think he's up to about page 800 or 900 in his manuscript, and he's just at Marx. So,
a couple of thousand.
Over 1,000, excuse me.
Thousand, yeah.
So, the Vice President for Academic Affairs of the Institute. We're very honored to have him associated with us, also editor of our Review of Austrian Economics, and is in charge of all the Institute's scholarly programs. Help me welcome, please, Professor Murray and Rothbard.
Thank you. I speak today about Ludwig von Mises, who's the eponymous, founder of the Institute. At least the name is, of course, taken from him. And one of the things we've sometimes been accused of is, since the name Mises is on the title of the Institute, that means we must be religious cultists. One of the phrases often used. And we're not religious cultists. We don't start off with the assumption that Mises was always right on every question. Just that he turned out to be right on almost every question. So that as independent thinkers, we arrive at this conclusion. And and it's really amazing how right he was on so many questions. And we're honoring him both for his scholarly output, the content of his views, and also his person, the way his life as being as an exemplary life that he conducted. It's hard to talk about the contributions of Mises because they were tremendous and almost impossible to encapsulate them, so I will try to do it at any rate. He started off as an economic historian. He wanted to be that, and never had an academic post. So he never had a full-time paid academic post, I should say. He never had the time to go into the archives and do archival work. And this, by the way, is sort of characteristic of Mises' career. Namely, they had neither in Austria nor in the United States did he have a full-time paid academic post. He just wasn't good enough, didn't have a proper publication record. And it's a tremendous indictment of academia, both in Europe and in the United States. The only place where he had an academic post was in Geneva for about 3 years. A paid academic post, I should say. So his occupation was that of economist of the Chamber of Commerce, which in Austria was like something like a Department of Commerce. It's sort of like a economic parliament. And the businessmen, community elected delegates to this chamber. And so from this position, Mises became the economist of the country, as one author put it, mainly the major economic advisor of the government. And problem, of course, was that the Austrian government, as all other governments in the 20th century, was pursuing a course totally opposite to what he counseled. But he didn't let that stop him in his pursuit of the truth. So this was after World War I. He was before and after World War I, and his major task was to try to stop the runaway inflation, which the Austrian government was in the process of conducting. Okay. And, can I have some water? Water glass, okay. And, he and another financial economist named Rosenberg conducted a two-man campaign to try to stop the inflation. And he wrote in his notes and recollection, his autobiography, where he's very upset about. He's fleeing the Nazis in 1940, and he said, well, maybe he shouldn't have done this because maybe he should have let the whole thing collapse and runaway inflation from the very beginning. Because what he succeeded in doing was stopping it at a certain point. In other words, before it became runaway inflation, before it happened in Germany, and stopping it when it was, 1,000 to 1 or whatever to the previous currency, because he said the inflation continued anyway, and so the whole process of capital consumption continued on without being any kind of a check. So in a sense, he might have done better to sort of let the thing happen. But he said, of course, he couldn't do any different. He saw the thing happening. He tried to do the best he could to stop it. And so his whole career was really this process of bucking the tide. In other words, bucking the trend of the 20th century in economics and politics and methodology, in all aspects of political economy. And so it didn't slow him down one iota. It was fantastic. Also, it did not embitter him at all, because those of us who were his students in the United States after he got to New York University, after, I guess he started at the age of 65 or something like that, and continued on until the age of about 88, retiring as the oldest living active professor, never bitter, never denouncing the world in general, or the economy or whatever. It was always extremely cheerful and constantly turning out research projects for the rest of us. Every 5 minutes he'd be lecturing and talking about, this is a good research project for you. It was kind of pitiful because most of the people there were, in New York University, were packaging majors, things like that, who were there for an easy A. Mises, coming over to the United States from Austria, did not understand the American grading system, because you have to be American, dyed-in-the-wool American Yankee to understand the crazed grading system. So he didn't know what A's and B's and all that stuff was. He gave everybody an A automatically. I told him he can't do that. So then he decided to alternate it. So every other person got an A and a B, alphabetically. And I said, you can't do that either. So he finally decided what he'll do is he'll give everybody an automatic B. Anybody who submits a paper of any sort, regardless of the merit of it, gets an A. That was a pretty good filtering device, as most people do not submit papers of any sort. So anyway, the bulk of the class, the 50 to 60% of any average seminar, didn't understand what was going on at all. They just knew that they were there for an easy B, at the very least. He was very cheerful, and didn't let that discourage him in this pursuit of productive students. And they had an arrangement, since the university was not paying his salary, since it was paid for by supporters, by group of businessmen and foundations. The university called him a visiting professor. He did have PhD students under him, but the university graciously allowed non-paying people like ourselves, or sort of Misesian types, to stay there, to come back for year after year, audit, of course. So it was this kind of a strange situation. We had a group of 8 or 10, depending on the year, 7 or 8 or 10 Misesian auditors, and 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever packaging majors. Now, there were certain exceptions. There were some good people coming through NYU who got a PhD under him, but they were few and far between. So generally, I would say he would toss out, he'd give an hour's seminar, lecture, and it was very interesting. It was sort of, there'd be a topic for the year, like methodology or money or banking or whatever, and each session, each weekly session, he'd give a sort of a slice of his full doctrine. In other words, sort of a cross-section of the doctrine. And so you could come at any time. You didn't have to come week after week. And because some of the auditors were coming, every 5 weeks or something like that, or when they hit town, you could pick up, you could understand the whole session, the whole lecture, because each one was sort of encapsulation, a different facet, sort of different, like a diamond, different facet of this of the general doctrine. And it was great stuff. So, and there were good people coming out of this, and good scholars, but it was very rare. And so I found it kind of a depressing situation, except at one point, I don't know if I put this in my book or not, but anyway, at one point, I had been at Columbia. I was sort of a lifelong Columbia attendee, sort of like Bill Evers is Mr. Stanford and David Gordon is Mr. UCLA. I was sort of like Mr. Columbia. And the Columbia, the economics students decided to invite Mises up for a talk about his crazy views, laissez-faire, etc. And it was packed. It was must have been 150 people in there. And he gave this talk about laissez-faire, non-intervention. And the one question I remember for the question period is somebody said, well, Professor Mises, aren't you also advocating intervention? Because you two are advocating the government repeal all this interventionary laws. Isn't that also intervention? A particularly moronic point that many, unfortunately, libertarians also make. And Mises, I don't think I'd ever heard this question before. And he said, well, he said, in the same way you could say that if somebody's run over by a truck, is lying there bleeding on the ground, if the doctor rushes over to save him, the doctor is also intervening in this person just like the truck did. And I think it's a very good riposte and very good analogy. So after this thing was over, I said, well, how did you like this? How did you like the session, Professor Mises? And he said, well, he said, I like my New York NYU students better. So it made me feel bad for him. Like it wasn't, he felt he was in much better ambiance in NYU than these characters of Columbia. I think to look at Mises' as I say contributions, they've been underweighted tremendously. I think Theory, Money, and Credit is one of the great books of the 20th century. It's a magnificent work. Every passage is worth studying, and a tremendous amount came out of that, of not only new material, new productive or creative insights, but also insights that have not been picked up by orthodox mainstream economics. One of the problems, this is a general insight on history of economic thought, the basic view of history of thought in general, not just economic thought, but history of social thought, philosophic thought, political thought, or whatever. One of the standard views I call the Whig theory of history of thought is that any new insight, any new truth gets almost automatically incorporated into the general canon. So in that case, there's no point, of course, if this is true, if any new good stuff that comes out gets incorporated into standard philosophy or economics or whatever, there then becomes no point in reading anybody before the current journal article, right? Because in other words, all good stuff has already been incorporated. All the dross has been sloughed off, has been carefully tested and sifted, and has been thrown out. There's no point there for anybody going beyond 1988 and reading anything before the current journal. And fortunately, I think with Kuhn and other historians of science, this has been unfortunately blasted away. I don't know if this blasting is as reverberated as most of the four corners of this scholarly universe. But it's pretty clear that this does not happen. It doesn't even happen in the hard sciences, as Kuhn pointed out. Stuff does not get automatically accepted. I'll come back to this at the end of the week and talk about future Wall Street economics. Truth does not get automatically accepted. Any truth, this is true not just in the social sciences, not just in philosophy, but even in physics, even in something which is allegedly hard laboratory, whatever, physics. It's not true that all truth gets automatically accepted. It has to be usually fought for because it's something new, it's different, and gets resisted. In the case of physics and astronomy, as far as I know, in the 18th century, for example, the new science, the idea of science was considered unscholarly, undisciplined, not part of the university system. So it had to be inculcated in the new academies that popped up. The universities only accepted it much later. So, and the point that I think Thomas Kuhn points out, which struck me as a very interesting way of putting it, that oxygen was discovered independently in the late 18th century by Lavoisier in France and Joseph Priestley in England. And Joseph Priestley, even though he was a radical person in general, he was a radical thinker, forward-looking type, ready to blast away at any accepted falsehood. Priestley denied to the end of his life that he ever discovered oxygen. It's not true, he said. No, I just discovered some dephlogisticated air. He was so wrapped up in the phlogiston theory, which had been the previous paradigm, he refused to acknowledge the worth of his own discovery. Very rare in the history of thought. It's not very often that people underweight their own contributions. But he did it because he was locked into this old paradigm. So even in the case of chemistry, seemingly, as I say, uncontroversial discipline, it's not true that truth automatically gets accepted, new truth. In the case of course, the social sciences or philosophy, there's no laboratory experiment, we can't look at the microscope and say, yes, it's true or whatever, you can't observe the ellipses. And so it's much more difficult for truth to win its way. Plus the fact you have, of course, ideological biases that come in, political biases, of course, distort it even more, makes it even more difficult. So we have Mises' contributions battling all these specific elements throughout his life. In Theory of Money and Credit, he records that the book, he was a member of von Bauwerk's famous seminar, and which is on the frontier of Austrian thought. And they spent, I think, 2 years or 2 terms, I forget now which, at least 2 terms, discussing Mises' Theory of Money and Credit. It was a big bombshell to think that the theory of marginal utility could apply to money. This was no Austrian had ever done this before, and they all decided it was incorrect. In other words, after considering this at some length, they decided it can't be done, and or it doesn't have to be done. So Mises then set out to, of course, form his own school of thought, if you want to put it that way. He obviously did not say, okay, the heck with von Bauwerk, I hereby found my own school of thought. But what happened is he started working on this on his own. Of course, people then began to be attracted to it. They couldn't believe that the theory of marginal utility could apply to money. Okay, and he did it. And it was a tremendous achievement. Just as he began to do it, only a few years after that, of course, then the marginal utility theory gets tossed out altogether because of Hicks and Allen claimed they can't be measured, and since utility is a measurable item, therefore you have to throw out utility altogether and come up with something else. Of course, Mises showed that marginal utility is not measurable, it doesn't have to be measured, it's purely ordinal. This is based on the work of his fellow von Bauwerkian Austrian Franz Schul, and in a book which I think only Mises has read. I don't think anybody else in this room has read this book. It's a great work in German. The first one to show that marginal utility is not measurable, it's strictly ordinal. I think it came out in 1906. At any rate, other things that Mises came up with in the book were the purchasing power parity doctrine. I think the scholastics had it, but he really put it for the first time in modern economics, that in the field of fiat currency, the long-run tendency is for the purchasing power, for the exchange rates to be fixed according to the purchasing power ratios of the currencies. He's never acknowledged for this. He's always said that Gustav Cassel discovered this. Cassell's version came up 3 or 4 years later, and it was very different. It was already sort of aggregative and unsound. And Mises is never credited for this point. He also had a great discussion of the index number problem. I'm going to start with a definitive view of it, never mentioned, and attacking Irving Fisher's index number concept, which of course won the field, and attacked the equation of exchange, another great section of Theory of Money and Credit, which nobody ever talks about. I think he eviscerates it. And all this stuff sort of flies by. It's never mentioned in economics texts. And then, of course, Mises's business cycle theory, which he starts in this, he doesn't fully expound it in Theory of Money and Credit, but it's there at the end, sort of the intimations of what he's going to do in the next few years. Plus is pointing out that purchasing power of the dollar or any purchasing power of any currency can't be summed up can't be averaged in an index number because it's not an average. It's an array. It's a full array of every good. So if you say what's the purchasing power of the dollar, it's not some index. It's everything you can buy with a dollar. An array of anything you possibly can buy with it. So the purchasing power of the dollar right now is whatever, 1/10 of a hat or one candy bar. It used to be 4 candy bars not too long ago. But anyway, you just list all the things which you think you can buy with $1, and that array is the purchasing power of $1. It's not, anytime you start averaging an index, you distort the situation. I think the theory of money and credit was quite popular in the German-speaking world. For one thing, he was also restoring the whole idea of the quantity theory, quantity money being important. Austria having been dominated by the German historical school, which means it's called anti-economics, which I think is a perfect description of all these guys. The historical school, the institutionalists, anti-economists. In other words, people not only who don't believe there are economic laws, but think there can't be such a thing. Again, falling the victim of translation into English. One of the problems in history of thought in general is British domination, at least until World War II. So we have a situation where England speaks and everybody sneezes, or whatever. England, I guess, blows its nose and everybody sneezes. So the theory becomes part of the generally accepted doctrine that somehow all economics emanates from England. And I don't think it was accepted necessarily on the continent, but somehow this gets to be so nobody ever talks about anything else, and nobody translates anything else, which is the key. I don't know if it's any, I don't want to disillusion anybody here, but almost all English and American scholars cannot read any other foreign language, including me too. I'm extremely weak in foreign languages. It's true of almost everybody else, including those who specialize in the history of the country in question, might I add. So that a friend of mine who studied Russian history at City College of New York, a distinguished place, swears on a stack of Bibles that the Russian historian didn't and doesn't know Russian. So even in the case where the person is a specialist in the area, his knowledge of the language is weak, especially with those who are just sort of general scholars. So therefore, if it doesn't get written in English, it doesn't exist. And that's what happened to Mises' theory of money and credit. It was translated only in 1934, 22 years after it was published, just in time for the Keynesian revolution to sweep the board and everybody to ignore it. So it was extremely poor timing. And it was also, the translation was ideological. In other words, it was translated under the supervision of Lionel Robbins. In those days, it was an Austrian Misesi, and it got translated Hayek and got Hayek and Mises translated in the early 1930s in England. Without him doing it, it probably wouldn't have been translated until the 1950s or 60s. So that's another thing. Who gets to read what depends on what gets translated. And what gets translated depends on ideology of the organization or the people doing the translating. Because translation is a pain in the neck, as a Hoppe and Schroeder test. So it's not something I wouldn't say nobody. Very few people set out in life to be professional translators, except people who work at the UN perhaps, and they're not usually scholars. So these things have to be organized, and somebody's got to do them, and usually, as I say, it doesn't get done. And one of the things I should say too, that typical both of Keynes and Mises, I have this in my little booklet. Keynes reviewed the theory of money and credit in a short note in the Economic Journal, to which I call your attention. And he said something like this. It's a very interesting book. It's the authors of the highest enlightened nature, or something like that, whatever that means. But he said he's disappointed because there's nothing new in it, nothing new or original in the book. Period. That sort of killed that. And in the treatise on money in 1931, about 18 years later or something, Keynes is ruminating in one of his footnotes. He said, he doesn't know German really well enough. He doesn't know German well enough to understand any new ideas in it. He can understand an idea he already knows, but he can't understand any new ideas. Okay? So here this guy has the effrontery, the chutzpah, to review a book in German and attack it for not being new. After then I'd say 20 years later, he can't understand can't glom on to can't understand any new ideas in German. So that's typical, I think, of Keynes. And Hayek writes that what a lot of heartache the world went through because Keynes didn't know German well enough. I think that sort of misses the point. It wasn't just that Keynes didn't know German. Keynes was the sort of person who would review a book in German if he doesn't know the language. At any rate, With the integration of with application of margin utility to money, Mises discovers the cash balance approach, or the demand for money approach, and I think was the first one to do it. I had a big fight. I wrote an article on Mises for the Palgrave Dictionary, and all my stuff on Palgrave sailed through without any problem. The article on Mises received a lot of flack, and the editor, who's an expert on Marshall, said, "You're wrong about that, because I was saying that the Cambridge school adopted a very different, a very aggregative version of demand for money theory, but it's considerably later, Pigou and Robertson." This guy said, no, Marshall had it in 1914 or something like that, in some testimony before Parliament. I didn't want to argue with him, because the thing is that I still think Mises preceded Marshall. It didn't really matter. So I said, okay. I didn't say in the article, in the final version, that the Mises discovered demand for money before that. I just said he discovered independently of the Cambridge school and let it go at that. Well, fortunately, what happened was they had all sorts of other problems. They thought the article was too pro-Mises. Kind of a strange critique, because the whole Palgrave Dictionary, as you know, is structured in sort of an odd way. And everybody gets to do his thing. In other words, the Marxists get 50 articles on Marx, all in favor of it, and the Keynesians get articles on Keynes, et cetera, et cetera. The Austrians got a dozen or something articles, pro-Austrian articles. So everybody gets his corner of the economic universe. So at any rate, they want to make a lot of suggested changes, but they were so happy, I guess, I gave in on this Marshall point that they forgot about the other changes. The rest of it sailed through. So I guess there's some lesson to be learned from this. Fight them on an unimportant point, or the rest of the stuff sail through. At any rate, in addition to this, so the Austrian is not accepting the older Austrian is not accepting the integration of the money field. After World War I, of course, we have the whole trend of social science and the world in general going against Mises doctrines. We have socialism, nationalism, communism, and interventionism in general, and also, of course, positivism, which Mises was there, of course, at the source, the center of positivism, namely Vienna, and he was combating all these people on every front, because he was battling in favor of economic truth. The logical positivist used to be called the Vienna Circle. And when I was going to Columbia, as part of my eternal Columbia trajectory or whatever, John Dewey had just faded out of the picture. He was already trailing clouds of glory, and he was retired or whatever, and the Deweyites were sort of getting eased out, and logical positivists were coming roaring in, and Mises told a marvelous story. He had a marvelous anecdote. He told a story one time at the seminar, or also was in the restaurant after the seminar, about he was walking with Max Scheler, his friend who was a German philosopher, in Vienna. And you do a lot of walking in Vienna. If you've ever been to Vienna, even I walk in Vienna, which I rarely walk anywhere. And so he's walking with Max Scheler. Max Scheler was saying, tell me, Lou, what is there about Vienna? What is there about this place? What is there about the climate of Vienna that breeds all these goddamn logical positivists? And Mises, the typical Misesian answer, he said, well, look, Max, he said, in Vienna there are 2 million people, and there are 12 logical positivists, so it can't be the climate. You should call it an anomalous answer or whatever. So, and he starts in after having he studied a lot of monetary problems in Austria during the war, and exchange rate problems. He gets very interested in money, of course, from the theory of money and credit on, and as a result of that, he writes a couple of for the Economic Journal on Austrian Hungary exchange rate. And he gets very interested in socialism, which of course were just coming up at that time. All these socialist governments were popped up in the 1919 era. And he writes this great article on economic calculation under socialism, and then follows it up with this book on socialism, which is a tremendous blockbuster, because in those days socialists cared about theory a lot. I mean, they really cared about the labor theory value and how socialism would work. My experience with current Marxists, they don't really care about theory at all. But in those days, they really cared about it and arguing about every fine point. And so this is a big blockbuster for them, because they thought, well, if you have socialism, everybody gets his labor time, you abolish money or whatever it was. And he systematically went through the thing and showed a socialist government cannot calculate even satisfying the goals of the dictators themselves, much less the consumers. So this, as I say, was a big blockbuster. Socialists, for about 20 years, tried to answer it, and Mises would reply to it and so forth. This even seeped into received doctrine at Columbia, and I was going to Columbia in the 1940s. We knew about, the only thing I knew about Mises and was the calculation debate. And the story was, of course, the accepted received doctrine at the time was Mises brought up the point, we honor him for this, for bringing up the point that socialism can't calculate, and then I guess Baroni showed that there are enough equations to solve the problem, whatever that's supposed to mean. And then Hayek said, well, in practice, socialism can't calculate, thereby allegedly retreating from the point that Mises said that theoretically they can't calculate. And then finally, Longa solving the whole problem by saying, play the market, assume you're part of the market. And this was supposed to have solved it. And so we all knew about Mises. We knew that Mises has raised the question about socialism. Of course, it was refuted twice, sort of. That was the end. And in actual practice, and by the way, Bergson, who the original, I guess, formulator of this particular line, later retreated by the 50s or 60s. He was saying, well, maybe socialism really can't calculate. But that was, I guess, too late for Mises to be awarded the palm on this. At any rate, of course, we know, as Austrians, we know there's no separation between theory and practice. The fact that you can't calculate in theory means you also can't calculate in practice, and vice versa. And there's no property in the means of production, therefore you can't have any price that means anything, reflects any kind of scarcity or cost. So he was sort of honored in a breach at that point. Interestingly enough, when Longa went back to Poland to become a top economist in Poland, the Polish communist government never instituted the Longa plan. As far as I know, no communist government has ever tried this sort of nonsense. Where you sort of tell the managers, act as if you're the market, and that's it. I mean, as far as I know, it's never been done. The move away from socialism, socialist planning in the last 20 years has been much different. It's been attempt to bring in profit and loss and decentralization and all the rest of it. So in addition to all that, so he's battling away at socialism, he's talking about interventionism and showing that interventionism can't work either. It's counterproductive. It causes problems which the government can't solve, which in fact the government creates more problems. And this leads, of course, since he already showed that socialism can't work, since interventionism leads either to repeal and back to free market or on to socialism, therefore it means interventionism can't work. So by this sort of logic, if interventionism is counterproductive and can't work, if socialism can't calculate, you're stuck with laissez-faire as the only answer. Stuck with a free market as the only answer, so to speak, to a modern economic system. So he was, of course, his marvelous books on liberalism and nation-state and utopia, nation-state and economy. He pointed this out, and he was attacked for being dogmatic and believing that what he said was true. I don't know, by the way, of any economist, philosopher, or anybody else who says something and doesn't think it's true when he says it. Everybody thinks what they say is true, otherwise they don't say it. Even moderates, even middle-of-the-road types, they think what they say is true also. So the idea that somehow if you're an alleged extremist, that you're being particularly more dogmatic than middle-of-the-roaders is not true at all. It has nothing to do. The two things are totally different. One is a sort of psychological, and the other is pure theory. I remember one economist we had in our Columbian, Albert Gaylord Hart, sort of semi-Austrian, semi-Keynesian or whatever, announced class that he was, for those days, I guess he felt he had to announce his ideology. He said, I'm a middle of the road who foams at the mouth on policy issues. And he was in the middle of the road who foams at the mouth. You can be extremist who's very quiet. You can be middle of the road who foams at the mouth. The two things are not commensurable questions. Mises also, another contribution he made later on, the Theory of Credit and Human Action, which was his great work, great masterpiece, is correcting Bombardek's errors on interest and setting up the Federal view of a pure time preference theory of interest. And Hayek never accepted that. Even in Hayek's Misesian period, never accepted the pure time preference theory of interest. Somehow it was a big block for many of the Austrians. And I commend, by the way, Federer on that. If you're interested in the capital interest, I think Federer's work is extraordinarily lucid and clear and well written and well thought out. And then, of course, top of everything else, on top of all these things he's facing, political problems, problems of interventionism and socialism, and problems of inflation and versus hard money. In addition to everything else, he's got the praxeology problem. In other words, he has a logical positivist world facing him. And what Mises was doing in methodology is he's simply saying, well, what sort of methodology the earlier Austrians used, what sort of methodology did J.B. Say use, etc., and came to the conclusion what they used was essentially praxeology without knowing it. And he set forth the proper methodology in this Grundprobleme. And so this is the way economics can arrive at truth, not by testing anything. There's no test available, there's no test possible, whatever. You do it through logic, saying this is true, axiomatically. People exist, for example, people make choices, people have values, and everything else follows from that. And if that's true, and everything else deduced from it is true, period. Therefore, apodictic, as to use one of our favorite phrases of Mises. It's apodictically true that therefore the people exist. Any action takes place through time. People choose values and try to pursue them, etc., etc. I remember when I first hired at Brooklyn Polytechnics. Brooklyn Poly is into its third name change by this time. It was originally called Polytechnics of Brooklyn when I taught there. They then changed it. They dropped the red word Brooklyn, which they felt was spoiling their image, and called themselves Polytechnic Institute of New York. And since many people then called them Piney, they then shifted to call Polytechnic University. They got the university in there, even though they really don't deserve it. At any rate, when I first got into the social science department there, they knew I had these crazy views. And the rest of the department, it was a social science department. And we had, I guess, 3 or 4 economists and a whole bunch of historians and other people, psychologists. And they knew I had these nutty views. They wanted to hire me, one, because I was sort of their shield and buckler against any kind of McCarthyite attack, since half of the department was Marxist. And they figured, well, we can't be a commie department. We got Rothbard on the staff here. So at any rate, we had a little seminar, the first and last seminar we ever had in this department, to figure out what are my views, what are my doctrines. I start off with the idea that people act, that people act to have motives. That's it. That's as far as I got. For 2 hours they challenged us. How do we know people have motives? The same people use the concept of motive in their own historical work, of course, all the time. No, people don't have motives. Because I guess they were afraid if they admitted that people had motives and acted, somehow they'd be forced into adopting a laissez-faire position. So we never got past page 1, paragraph 1. At any rate, so with praxeology, they say Mises was running against the entire intellectual outlook of the world. Not in economics, of course. Lionel Robbins' Nature and Significance was really a praxeological work. I mean, there are differences of opinion on this between me and Kerzner. I think it's basically a praxeological work, diluted, it's sort of milk and water. It's praxeology plus dilution plus some water in there, but it's basically praxeological. And this was the official methodology of economics until Friedman's article in 1950, was it 53 or something? Before, it's not that actually economists pursue the praxeological method in the United States and England, but at least they pay lip service to it, with a lot of grumbling underneath. But basically they said, yes, we have these axioms and we deduce from it. And of course with Friedman, the whole thing is of the water, the dam burst, and from then on it was all testing and hypothesis. Who cares if it's false, provided it makes the correct predictions? That sort of stuff then came in after the 1950s. Because the fact that nobody can predict anything didn't seem to faze these people at all. So they told me, yes, we predict, and that's it. That's all you need. So Mises had to, as I say, combat this, and I continued on and doing that very patiently and developing the theory and human action and theory and history, which is one of the great neglected works. Showing the difference, patiently explaining the difference between theory, what theory is on one hand, what history is on the other, and what the relationships are between them. And interesting enough, his brother was one of the founding logical positivists, Richard von Mises, and His brother was an aeronautical engineer who came into economics through this kind of social science, I should say, philosophy through that. And when Richard von Mises' book Positivism came out, I asked him, imprudently asked him, Professor, what did you think of your brother's book? I should not have asked. I didn't realize his family history. Anyway, he was very sweet of me. He said that he drew himself up. Mises was full height. He said, I disagree with that book from the first sentence to the last. That was it. So I still think, however, that Mises' probability theory, which is a marvelous part of human action, which is not talked about much, is really based on Richard von Mises' probability theory. And it's, I'll go into that more this week, but it essentially destroys all probability theory in social sciences, including, of course, most economics, I think, economic theory rests on probability theory to make any kind of application at all. And, but this essentially says that all the fractions, we know all the fractions, all the alleged probability fractions are meaningless unless they're tested, unless they're empirically derived. So that if you say the probability of a head coming up, if you toss a coin 500 times, the probability of a head coming up is 1/2. You can say it because you've tossed it quite a bit at least. I mean, it could be a loaded coin, in which case it's not true, of course. But you can still say, all right, if it's not a loaded coin, keep tossing it, and more or less asymptotically arrive at 1/2, the probability of tossing a head. And if you notice, by the way, all times probability theory is applied to economics, they always say, well, it's like a lottery. So you got a lottery, you got 1 million tickets, you pull one ticket out, therefore the probability is 1/1,000,000th. And what they're of course ignoring is the fact that life is not like a lottery. This begins to sound like these Zen Buddhist gurus, my son, life is like a butterfly, that sort of thing. Life is not like a lottery, because in a lottery, you've got a certain number of events, a certain number of terminal events, and each event is homogeneous with the other event, and each event is random. There's no relationship whatsoever between the first time you pick the ticket, let's say, and the 10th time you pick the ticket, the first toss of the coin and the 10th time. So probability theory only works with this kind of very restricted kind of assumptions. Of course, in real life, things in economics and politics and entrepreneurship, totally different. There's no homogeneity at all, and certainly no randomness. Everything influences everything else. So there you're stuck with no social science theory, seems to me, period. What's the probability of George Bush being elected president this year? Well, if you take an infinite number of 1988 elections, you can say, well, let's say Bush will be elected 28% of the time or whatever. Obviously, the whole thing's ridiculous. There's no infinite number of 1988 elections. There's no homogeneous event. That's not random. Anyway, these are some of the things. Mises sort of tosses this out in Human Action. It's a marvelous chapter, which I think should be stressed and reread. So I could go on with this, sort of like almost an infinite cornucopia of material about Mises. One thing I should say about his business cycle theory in the 20s was based on, and his monetary theory based on the currency school, now much derided in Britain, and who believe in 100% reserve banking, believe anything else was fraudulent and or inflationary, and the currency school tried to get to arrange the monetary system in such a way so the money supply would automatically reflect the exact amount of changes in the gold supply, and they were not very successful at this. But Mises very explicitly says in Human Action that that heart was in the right place, but unfortunately they didn't realize, for example, that demand deposits are part of money, just as much money as banknotes. And also they trusted the Bank of England to sort of carry out the job for them. But basically he brought back the currency school, integrated that with the Wicksellian theory of interest, and arrived and of course added his own genius to arrive at the theory of business cycles. And unfortunately there's been a sort of a falling off of interest among Austrians in the currency school at this point. I'm trying to revive it, engaging in one of my typical crusades to try to revive this Misesian doctrine. And that's one of the problems. I'll talk about that too this week, money and banking. So, as I say again, Mises, when he gets in after World War II, and he flees the United States, academia in those days was filled with German and Austrian and whatever refugees, and usually the red carpet was rolled out for them if they were Marxists. All branches of Marx in those days, of course, there were many branches of Marx, Trotskyists, psychological Marxists, Stalinists, whatever, all sorts of in between, semi-Maoists or whatever. And all of them got top jobs in academia, Harvard, New School for Social Research, Princeton, whatever. Mises didn't get anything, and Hayek either. As a matter of fact, I don't know how many people know this part of it. There was an outfit called the William Volcker Fund, a lovable little outfit, now totally forgotten. Some researcher in the history of the movement should do something about, because they were a key to scholarship, libertarian and conservative scholarship from, let's say, late 40s until 1962, when they collapsed in a fit of hysteria. For those 15 years or so, they were the key to all scholarship in the movement. They found scholars, found independent, isolated scholars, and encouraged them to write stuff. And at any rate, they finally had a publishing house for about a year before the Volcker Fund collapsed. At any rate, they made it part of their crusade to try to find an academic post for Mises and Hayek. They couldn't find a paid academic post for either Mises or Hayek. Even though Hayek was much less hated than Mises was. For one thing, his style was different. First of all, he was unintelligible most of the time. So if you're unintelligible, you can get away with more than if you're clear and lucid. And second of all, he did think, of course, the theory, road of serfdom was dedicated to the socialists of all parties. He really believed it. Hayek really believed it was dedicated to socialism. Mises never dedicated anything to socialists. So, but even with this difference, Hayek didn't get a paid post either. What happened was he got a visiting professorship at the University of Chicago, not in the economics department, which turned him down flat, but in the crazed Committee of Social Thought, which is a charming department. I'm not going to attack it. Just the sort of committee where you get a job, if you get a PhD from it, there ain't no job you can get because you're an expert in social thought. What's that? Okay, so you can't get it's very difficult to get an academic post with a PhD in a non-existing department. Okay, so Hayek taught in that department, and just so happens I know two of his students who got a PhD under him because they're dedicated characters, and they went to this. But at any rate, his salary was paid for not by the University of Chicago, but by the Volcker Fund and Leonard Read and whatever, this whole little consortium of businessmen who paid for his salary. Okay. Mises was an NYU Graduate School of Business, which is a much lower rank than the University of Chicago, and his salary was paid for by the same group. At Chicago, when Hayek got a retirement age, the University of Chicago refused to pay any pension. Any of his pension. Remember, nowadays everybody gets a pension, right? Everybody. If you're in New York City, for example, if you're a politician who's been fleecing the city of millions, you get your pension. Even if you're in jail, you get your pension, right? So they refused to pay Hayek any pension. That's why Hayek went back to Europe. And in the case of Mises, I don't think the pension was even brought up because he wasn't even in that status. But at any rate, in NYU, the original dean, was very friendly to Mises and got him in there, allowed him to get in, or whatever. After that, however, the ideological tide turned, and the dean was always trying to discourage people from taking the course. Don't take Mises' course, a religious cult. He's a Neanderthal, whatever. And so nobody pays attention to him. He's trying to discourage people. And of course, it's easy for deans to discourage students from taking the course. However, he persisted, and not heedless of all this miserable environment. So at any rate, I think I've indicated that Mises was both exemplary in his person and his contributions to scholarship and economics and in general, in social science and philosophy in general. Let's say he's always trying to get us to do research projects. Yes, do that. This is a great subject, great topic for you to work in, and so forth. And sometimes this was heated. No, not very often, but it did happen on occasion. And so I don't think I ever saw him really bitter at all. The only time he was I think slightly depressed is when Columbia University, which had my beloved ex Mr. Columbia moniker, Columbia University had its triple centennial, whatever you call it, 300th anniversary in 1954, and 200, bicentennial. Anyway, it was set up, I guess, in 1754 by grant of King George, and And so Columbia invited all sorts of big shots to it to speak, and including all of Mises's former students, Hayek, Machlup, Morgenstern, Harbauer, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't invite Mises, even though Mises was only 20 blocks away. So he was kind of bitter about that. I certainly don't blame him for this. That's the only time I've ever heard him as any bitter in any sense. And he was very friendly to deviationists. Those are former students of his, like Hayek. He was astonished when Hayek became a Popperite. Certainly was not in favor of it, but he sort of swallowed hard and kept on. And so in general, as I say, I think I think I would safe to say I think anybody who actually took Mises' course for any length of time, even for 1 or 2 sessions, remained a Misesian forever, because we never, that was sort of enough to sustain us for the rest of our working lives. Thank you very much. Can I take any questions? Okay. Thank you. If you want to. Yeah. Any questions or comments or something, Jeffrey?
Yeah, William Niskanen wrote an article for Tulloch Feshriff on bureaucracy, and he opens it up with saying that very few things have been written before Tulloch on the theory of bureaucracy.
Trump.
One of them was Mises. He said that it was theoretically vacuous.
It was great. It was a magnificent book, Bureaucracy. It's a very short book, and what he said basically was there are 3 kinds of well, first of all, he said there are 3 kinds of institutions. There's profit-making, there's non-profit, private non-profit, and there's government. And that in the case of profit-making institution, you have profit and loss test, for both capital investment and operation. What do you do when you have government? And essentially, the magnificent point that he makes there is with government, you have to be bureaucratic. There ain't no such thing as a non-bureaucratic government. Because a lot of socialists, are also against bureaucracy. They'll say, yeah, we agree that bureaucracy is bad, we have to do something about it. What Mises pointed out was once you have government, since there's no profit test, since the government taxes funds away and gives it to the different parts of itself, you have to have bureaucracy to find out what the hell's going on, make sure these guys don't steal all of it. In other words, you have to have these crazy rules and sign and triplicate and all that. Otherwise, all the money would be just flowing in, flowing out. So bureaucracy is inevitable. In other words, he wasn't so much attacking bureaucracy per se as saying that once you have government operations, you're going to have bureaucratic, inefficient, and all the rest of it. And that non-profit institutions have this problem. They have a sort of they have a lurking problem of this sort of thing. Though it's obviously not as bad as government. I know one friend of mine was converted to laissez-faire, Misesianism, by standing in line, a registration line at Hunter College, I believe it was. And another friend of mine was a Misesian. I kept working away at him as the line wended its way for 2 hours. Registration. See what happened with government? By the time the guy got to the window, he was converted. Sort of existential conversion. Anyway, it's a great book. I recommend everybody reading that. And that's much better. Tulloch was interesting as a sort of stories about Tulloch on the State Department. But this is really great theoretical work. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Thank you.